Good morning and welcome everyone to the call today. The session is being recorded for replay afterwards on our website. The slides will also be published there afterward as well. So a brief introduction on my side. I'm Nadia Cote. I'm the Managing Director for Regional Unit London and Nordics at AGCS. So on the call today, we're going to take a look at the key headlines from a recent Allianz Risk Barometer for 2023. Then we will focus on top 10 risk for the UK and also for the Nordics. Within these, we'll do a deep dive on some of the key risks with Michaela, Serge and Anthony. And then we will leave plenty of time for a Q&A session at the end, and we will have also Tim with us for that as well. Slides. So the 12th Allianz Risk Barometer incorporates the view of 2,712 respondents from a record 94 countries and territories. The survey was conducted among Allianz customer, broker and industry trade organization, as well as risk consultant, underwriters, senior managers and claim experts in the corporate insurance segment of both AGCS and other Allianz entities. Respondents were questioned through October and November 2022 and were asked to select the industry about which they were particularly knowledgeable and to name up to 3 risks they believe to be the most important. The survey focused on large, small and mid-sized companies. Most answers were from large-sized companies, representing 47% of the respondents, while mid-sized companies contributed to 19% and small enterprises produced 34%. Risk experts from 23 industry sectors were featured. Here we see the global top 10. So a few notes to start. The figure represents how often a risk was selected as a percentage of all survey response from the 2007-12 respondents. So all respondents could select up to 3 risks per industry, which is why the figure does not add up to 100%. New means a new entry in the top 10 global risk in the case of political risk and violence. It ranked 13 in the last year Allianz Risk Barometer. Energy crisis appear in the Allianz Risk Barometer for the first time. Cyber incidents rank higher than business interruption based on the actual number of responses rather than the percentage. Same for other entries with percentage that are the same. Looking at the risk themselves, the headlines are on the slide. I'm not going to go through them all individually, but key points are: cyber and business interruption retain the key position on the top and second spot. Economic threats and energy risk both rise. Natural catastrophe and climate change drop down the ranking as companies prioritize pressing macroeconomic concern, inflation, the energy crisis, and possible recession. Pandemic outbreaks plummets down the list of worries as COVID-19 restrictions have largely been removed. In the UK, the top 3 risks mirror the global results. Cyber first, business interruption second, and macroeconomic development newly third, as the impact of inflation weighs heavily on the UK firms after it rose to 10% during 2022. Climate change is the UK biggest faller in this year's ranking, down to 7th from 3rd place in last year's survey as companies prioritize pressing macroeconomic concerns, inflation, the energy crisis, and possible recession. In addition, the previous year's survey was conducted at the same time as the COP26 summit took place in Glasgow, resulting in it being front of mind for people taking the survey back then, and its highest ever positioning in our UK results. Turning to an aggregate of Nordic countries, here's the top 10 for Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden. As with the UK and global result, the top 3 are the same. Striking here is the third, fourth, and fifth rankings are the new entrants to the top 10, showing how the past year has radically shifted the risk landscape. Again, we see nat cats and climate change for both falling the rankings from previous year as companies focus on pressing macroeconomic concerns and the impact of the war in Ukraine. So now we will do a deep dive in some of the key focus area today. So just a quick word to say that we covered the topic of macroeconomics on a global call on Tuesday this week. You can listen to the Allianz Group Chief Economist updating on this topic on the website if you missed that. And now I will I will ask Michaela to first take us through our cyber deep dive. Michaela, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. So as we've seen in the previous slide, shouldn't come as a surprise, cyber incidents still maintain the top position in the list of the top business risks as perceived by our respondents. And that is true in 19 countries globally, including, of course, our own UK and the Nordic region. And that is really driven by 2 main factors, I would say. The first one being digitalization and changes in business practices. Particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen several companies, but even industries more broadly, rushing towards digitalization and making better use of technology, which has of course increased the reliance on technology and computer systems in order to operate effectively. In addition to that, we've also seen companies making broader use of tools such as remote working, which simply broaden the attack surface that need to be protected. The second factor is the sheer level of cyber incidents that we're seeing, with companies of all sizes being targeted. While some might think that large companies would make more attractive victims for cyber criminals, we're actually seeing an uptake also in these small and mid-sized segments. Within the scope of cyber incidents, according to our respondents, their top concern remains data breaches. And that is also proven by the fact that at the moment, the average cost of a data breach is at an all-time high. And that is potentially bound to increase even further due to inflationary pressures. Again, according to our respondents, the second key risk within the scope of cyber incidents remains ransomware. And if I move on to the next page, I would say that ransomware has truly been a second pandemic running in parallel to the COVID-19 pandemic over the last couple of years. What we're seeing in general has been an exponential increase in both the frequency and severity of ransomware attacks. We've seen these attacks becoming increasingly sophisticated, and also the sheer size of ransom demands increasing substantially. Ransomware as a service has truly been one of the key drivers of that increased frequency, as it enables even non-expert hackers to actually purchase tools and services from more complex groups, more dedicated groups, and then launch large-scale campaigns against companies globally. Multiple extortion has been a key contributor to that increase in severity instead, as we see hackers, while they have control over a company's computer system, using that opportunity to also exfiltrate data and then threaten to sell that data on the dark web, unless a second ransom payment is made. So there's that compounded impact. Supply chain attacks also make for a very interesting dynamic. We're seeing increased targeting of software and IT service providers. Some of you might have heard of the likes of Kaseya and SolarWinds, which were all over the press, but also physical supply chains and critical infrastructure. This is, of course, concerning, as this type of attacks can have more widespread consequences. As for instance, we've seen the Kaseya breach having an impact on several retailers in the Nordic region. So all in all, ransomware remains very concerning, with some analysts even forecasting global damages to companies reaching the 30 billion mark by 2023. If we look now at the outlook, so moving on to the next page, and the implications of this current threat environment, I would say that ESG has become a very, very key topic for companies globally. And I would like to highlight the fact that maintaining a strong cybersecurity posture with good governance and controls is absolutely crucial to the G within ESG. And this is important because it enables companies not only to be able to prevent attacks from happening in the first place, but in that unfortunate circumstance in which an attack is successful, allows them to recover more quickly. And in addition to that, it also offers mitigation to litigation risk and regulatory exposure, particularly when we're seeing more governments enforcing stricter and more severe privacy regulations, which of course can result in increased investigation risks, but even fines and penalties levied against companies. The last trend that I would like to mention is the increased potential for nation-state or state-sponsored attacks. Now, that is purely driven by the current geopolitical situation, of course. What we're monitoring very closely is attacks by either groups that are officially part of governments or even groups that are linked to governments, and that are targeting national critical infrastructure, but even organizations of every shape and size in unfriendly territories. And another element that we're closely monitoring is the activity of hacktivists. So hacking groups that are politically motivated, whether they're affiliated to a country or not, but that launch attacks to further their political agenda. This trend is very concerning globally, of course, because it can have widespread consequences. We've all seen a few years ago what happened with, for instance, the WannaCry and NotPetya attacks that really brought some very large global companies to a halt, even though those were not the primary target. So this is something that we're closely monitoring because it could have a more widespread impact. At the moment, we're not seeing as much activity as the potential of it. What we're seeing is attacks being targeted at specific pockets. For instance, a couple of months ago, public entities within specific countries, such as the Baltics and Italy, were targeted. At the same time, though, we're also starting to see analysts clearly pointing the finger at Russia, for instance, in a very recent breach of a national postal service. So I would conclude with a recommendation to everyone to keep monitoring closely alerts and guidance provided by the relevant national cybersecurity centers. And with that, I'm handing over to my colleague Serge, who will dive even deeper into the topic of political violence.
Thanks, Michaela. Thank you, everybody, and thanks for joining us for this risk barometer debrief. So I'll be looking at the political risk and political violence peril, giving you my explanation of what it is, how it's trending globally, and also focusing a little bit on the UK and the Nordics specifically. So as you can see, it's a new entrance back into the top 10 after a few years of absence. This is exactly within my expectations, because the trends that we've been seeing over the last certainly 5 years, but certainly the last 2, has been the increased risk, despite the COVID thaw that we saw as a line of business. So what do we mean by political risk and political violence? So I think we need to clarify that this is probably more specifically called political violence in the insurance space, but there are a number of perils associated with it, and they vary depending which country you're in. But we start with the terrorism and sabotage. That is the standard, or we call it vanilla, offering within this space. There is additional covers like SRCC, or strikes, riots, civil commotion, and malicious damage. And this is a peril that is covered across different lines of business. It's not specifically covered under the political violence peril, but also offered by property, engineering, energy, etc. And then finally, we have the war and civil war, which includes warlike perils, and that could be anything like coup d'etat, insurrection, rebellion, and various associations or playing on words to that effect. So those are the key political violence perils. The additional coverages that the market offers, and that specifically we're focusing on here, is terrorism liability, which is death, injury to third parties or third-party property damage. We also have nuclear, chemical, biological, and radiological acts, and this could be predominantly based around the terrorism trigger. Active assailant and active shooter, which is more commonly associated with North America and Western Europe, but we are seeing trends that it's being purchased in other parts of the world as well. And finally, cyber terrorism, which Michaela covered briefly on there. That is, it's on the rise. We're seeing particular industries focusing on this peril as a buyback to their conventional policies, and it's mostly based around industries such as energy and power and utilities. So those are the kind of the summary of what we mean by political violence and political perils. If you could go on to the next slide, please, and I'll cover the global trends. So I think if we kind of ignore the COVID period, which has really seen a reduction in a number of perils, the general trend that we've seen in our market has been as follows. So on the terrorism and sabotage side, we've seen a reduced threat to property damage and business interruption, but particularly property damage. So what we've seen is an increased number of low intensity attacks, low sophistication. So that would mean a weapon style attack or a vehicle usage, something along those lines, as opposed to the traditional association with terrorism, which is a bomb targeting a particular sort of area, a building or a government. So we've seen this as a trend. So it's a reducing, I suppose, severity, but an increased frequency. Although COVID saw a reduction in these, as everybody was locked up in their homes almost 2 years, what we're seeing now is that the trend is slightly increasing, and those will continue, I believe, going forward. But it's kind of hard to predict whether they will ever make a comeback as they did prior to COVID and maybe 10, 15 years ago. But the threat is still there. It's very credible. What we've also seen in the terrorism space is movement. What I classify as is irrational terrorism. It's not it's all irrational, but it's what I mean by this is that there's been a shift from traditional terrorists associated with separatist, nationalist movements that kind of have an end goal in their sort of modus operandi and their aim, which is, for example, the IRA was unification of Ireland. ETA was a separatist movement, similar to Colombia, which was so FARC in Colombia were a left-leaning group. Obviously, it had links to the organized crime as well, but they were very much started as a communist guerrilla movement to move Colombia back towards communism and left wing. These, although they haven't disappeared, they've definitely reduced in significance. And what we see now is a Islamist or a far-right risk, which is probably no surprise. But what that also means is that there is no opportunity to negotiate. There is no end goal to a lot of these movements. They're constantly cyclical and looking for new things, and they tend to target people over property. And if they do target property, it's mostly related around governmental buildings. So this is the trend on the terrorism side, and we're kind of monitoring it closely, obviously. The big peril, I think, for the next 12 to 18 months for us and for the market is the SRCC, so strikes, riots, civil commotion. There is a large number of issues that are fueling this. It's not always the same thing if you look across the world and countries. We have we've got environmental protesters which have sometimes turned violent. That's something that's definitely on the increase. We've got a huge cost of living crisis globally, and that's fueling resentment and activism. And what we've seen is that economic situations like that, although there are trends across the world, they're being handled differently in different countries, and that has a lot to do with how wealthy a country is and how much of a kind of safety net they have and provide for their people, which would link us nicely to how when we talk about specifically the region. Unlike terrorism, we've seen an increased risk of SRCC, and not only is there more events, they become more and more intense and catastrophic. So you can go back 3 or 4 years, and there have been multi-billion-dollar events related around strikes, riots, civil commotion. You can talk about Chile, you can talk about Colombia, North America, and even going back as far as 2011, 2010 in the UK and also in Thailand, for example. But those are the big events that make the press. What we've seen is there's a lot of small trends in regions and cities around sort of specific topics, whether it's a shooting of a black man in America, or a closure of a road, or a proposal to build a new airport. There's always something, and people are really willing to hit the streets. And the other feature of the SRCC space that we've seen is if these problems are not dealt with, they persist and they're long lasting. So if there has been a strike or riot or civil commotion for a particular issue and it hasn't been resolved adequately, then it comes back. So this is something that we're really watchful on. So the response to a lot of these incidents is really key to understanding what's coming up in the short to medium term again. War and civil war, well, very relevant, and I think this time last year we weren't in this state, but what we've noticed over the last 5 or 6 years, but so preceding the Ukraine war, is there's been a big shift in divisive politics, and there are countries that are not part of that, but there are certain places where this has really been prevalent. And what I mean by that is it could be based around ethnic lines, cultural lines, religious lines, and that is something that we've been really watchful of. What we've also seen is that externally, so moving from the civil war risk, we've seen more active states, and this goes back maybe about a decade. With the strengthening of Russia and China and Saudi Arabia and Iran over the last sort of 5 to 15 years, really, or 10 to 15 years, we've seen them acting externally much more with use of military, with the use of their economic power, and that naturally leads to resentment, but also potential conflict with other states. We've seen this play out in Ukraine through a proxy war between Russia and let's say the West, but also this is common in places like the Middle East, where Saudi Arabia and Iran always take opposing side based around the religious the religious sides of issues. And the other side of war and civil war, and Michaela mentioned this, is the increasing capability of state-sponsored cyber hackers. And although not a big peril within what we offer, but it is something that we're very watchful on, especially for those industries I mentioned, which is the power, utilities, and also some elements of governmental. So these are the global trends. I'm going to go into a bit more regional now. If you can go on to the next slide, thank you. So regionally, UK, it's number 10. So it's as a global trend, the political violence perils. It doesn't surprise me. I think I live in the UK, and I've noticed that there is a big shift in attitude, big shift in views of government, and generally it's a much more divided society than it was before. And although some of the fear is based around global events, I think this is very relevant for the UK. Political violence is something that's we're closely monitoring. For example, the Brexit. Brexit has had a flare up in Northern Ireland in particular, and that's a question that doesn't feel like it has a resolution in the short to medium term. So naturally, that increases the risk of Republican versus Unionist issues and violence in Northern Ireland. The SRCC risk is on the rise. We talked about the motivations, economic, also political and environmental. These are the common trends we see, and it's not exclusive to London, although London is something that we've monitored closely, and it's usually the hub of a lot of the protests that we're seeing. And there is a low risk. We do have some relatively strong unions in the UK, but these generally haven't resulted in violence. But what they have resulted is in much resentment against unionized strikes and workers, especially when they don't have a sympathetic or empathetic government towards their cause. Obviously, the war is a concern, but being an island nation and almost the westerly in Europe, this risk is relatively remote for the UK at the moment. In the Nordics, the political violence perils are rated as number 4, and I feel that if there is no expansion of the Ukraine war, this may drop down the list, and it's understandable why. So Ukraine war is predominantly driving this, I suppose, the result. It doesn't surprise me. I suppose being neighbours to Russia, Finland is naturally more exposed, but also as Sweden and Norway. And so it doesn't surprise me it's increased. The recent attack on Nord Stream, maybe Anthony will cover elements of that in his section. This is again not a surprise to us from an underwriting perspective. It is classified as, I believe, as sabotage, but it is potentially a trend that's going to be increasing. And if you just look over the border to Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia, there was a recent explosion on a pipeline which could be classified as sabotage, but I haven't seen any press articles to define it specifically. And this is a trend that we're monitoring. Cyber dominates the Nordic response, and Michaela's covered that, but it's also a concern for us, especially for the industries that I mentioned, which is the energy sector, particularly Norway, because this is a direct competitor to Russian gas and oil to Europe as a supplier. So that is something that we're really watchful on. With regards to SRCC, I don't feel that's a big peril in the Nordics. This is, I mentioned a little bit about the welfare state, and I often look back at every year there's a happiness index launched about happiest countries in the world, and pretty much hands-on top 10 you will always get Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland. And lo and behold, I looked it up this morning, and yet 2022 happiness index, all those countries are in the top 10. And that tells you a lot about, I believe, in my opinion, about how much the state looks after the people and their wellness. And I think that has a direct correlation to the risk of SRCC in the Nordics, and I believe that is low. There is a strong union, but I think they're very much in unison with the government and the Nordic style of governing across the field. And then finally, the risk of small-scale terrorist attacks. I believe this is maybe a concern for the Nordic region. Islamist and far right. There's also a far right increase in a few of the countries in the Nordics, and that's something that we're monitoring closely. So I'm going to stop there, but obviously there's questions and answers at the end for any specific questions, and I'll pass on to my colleague Anthony. Thank you.
Thank you, Serge, and welcome to all joining us today. I'm going to provide a brief insight into our views of the ongoing energy crisis. This is a new entrant to the Allianz Risk Barometer, coming in 4th both globally and in the UK, marginally lower at 5th in the Nordics. The fact that energy, and more specifically both the availability and cost of energy, have not featured on our risk barometer previously, and yet now appear at such a high level in such a short period, is an indictment of the fragility and sensitivity of our global energy system, as well as questioning long-held geopolitical beliefs around the behavior of nation states. The Russian invasion of Ukraine continues to exact a horrific human cost. However, the impacts obviously go much further and wider than the appalling images we see on the news. Economic and political waves of instability that were put in motion will take many years to subside. The over-reliance of major European economies on cheap and plentiful Russian gas has on one hand been credited as fueling economic growth for long periods of time. Germany's Mittelstand companies have long been heralded as a triumph of industrial economic policy. However, their success to a significant degree was based upon a stable, cost-effective energy supply. The wisdom of relying on a single supplier for the majority of your energy security has been sharply called into question, with understandable political consequences. And when you combine that with the unfortunate timing of French nuclear power station maintenance, drought conditions throughout Europe, both limiting hydropower and accentuating demand for energy, that continued with the attack on Nord Stream that Serge just mentioned, it's clear why energy costs rose so sharply. Europe saw costs of close to 500 euros per megawatt hour, which were previously unheard of. And the planned shutdowns of nuclear and coal power plants were rapidly reassessed, with some very awkward political consequences for European governments. If you reduce the issue to two main drivers, which is a gross simplification, admittedly, energy prices or energy price rises, coupled with the lesser known fact that Ukraine provided a huge proportion of the world's food supply, has led us to the high inflation environment that we have seen and will continue to see for some time. There are many sort of quotes from economists past and present about the scourge of inflation, which I won't bore you with, but far from inflation being an abstract concept, it has real life impacts. If we use the UK as an example, and again, Serge mentioned this just now, we have the reality of workers in various fields, including nurses for the first time, taking strike action with the aim of obtaining wage increases that will, in some part, address the cost of living crisis. For our clients, particularly those within my area of energy and construction, and where energy is a significant component of their overall costs, 22 was a brutal year, just as we'd been emerging from an unprecedented period of pandemic. Not only that, but the finely tuned modern supply chains that were driven by decades of globalization started to look more and more fragile. Our own experience in loss situations is that incidents that should in previous years have been addressed in 6 months and 12 months were taking 50%, 100% longer due to the poor availability of components and supplies. Clients' replacement cost values were increasing at rates we haven't seen in decades, and risk managers have been and will continue to be under pressure from their brokers and from their insurance partners to ensure that what's being declared is a fair assessment of the desired risk transfer. I mean, and that's before we start talking about business interruption values that have been going up and down depending on where you sit in the value chain, particularly when it comes to the energy industry. There have been consequences on the risk side, potentially as a result of industrial plants running harder after 2 or more years of slow activity due to the pandemic. Reactivating plants, carrying out delayed maintenance, etc., potentially has had consequences. For us, 22 had an above average number of large incidents in the energy space, which is obviously concerning for us as an insurer, but we're very conscious that our clients would much rather avoid those loss scenarios to begin with for very good reason. We look to partner with our clients and provide value not just through the risk transfer that we offer, but where we can and where there's willing, we have our risk consulting teams that are very capable of adding value to our clients in those questions. However, and I think if we switch to the next slide, there are significant opportunities that have been generated by the ongoing situation, and namely that is the incredible acceleration of the energy transition. Whether it's wind, solar, hydrogen, or other low carbon technologies, the rapid plans to scale up their contributions to the energy mix could not have been predicted at the beginning of 2022. The combination of legacy energy, mainly oil and gas players, as well as new entrants, are driving levels of investments that run into the hundreds of billions, if not trillions. The US has passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which is squarely aimed at boosting the energy transition. The EU and member governments, and also the UK outside of that, are being urged to follow suit. The press is full of numbers and statistics about what exactly is required to address energy security, 1.5-degree pathways and net zero futures. I do not personally believe that there will be a single magic bullet, and some of the avenues that are currently being explored may end up being dead ends, either technologically or economically. For our regions, between the UK and Nordics, we have obviously the North Sea, which has been a long-standing resource for the oil and gas industry, and yet now it's perhaps poised for a rebirth as a future low-carbon energy center point. The proposed growth in offshore wind, new energy islands, carbon capture, electrolyzer projects in what is a fairly hostile or very hostile environment brings great opportunity, but also heightened risk. AGCS's experience of operating in that area due to our oil and gas involvement over the years, we believe will be a crucial differentiator for us and for you. That extends onshore as well as where we're starting to see significant traction with the green hydrogen projects, amongst others, that are starting to get through final investment decisions. We have the capacity, we have the engineering expertise and the underwriting experience to apply to these transition activities. And in many areas, we're already considered a leader in those fields. We want to partner with our clients as they grow in these areas and provide the risk transfer solutions that are needed to facilitate those ongoing investments. We need to be mindful that at a portfolio level, at least, we need the capacity that we deploy to generate returns for our shareholders. This will require careful underwriting from our side and understanding of the exposures that we're taking on, data, information, and a willing client base that wants to partner with us will go a long way towards achieving that goal. To close, I wish I could say that the energy crisis will not appear on the Allianz Risk Barometer next year. However, there are simply too many unknowns at this point. Will the Ukraine war end? Will there be regime change in Moscow? Will the weather be benign? Will governments manage to tackle inflation in their countries and at what social cost? From an energy security perspective, Europe is in a much better place now than it was in early 22, and there are positive signs, but the investment in the energy transition will take time to come to fruition. What I believe is now clear is that these investments in the transition are both necessary and timely, and AGCS is here and willing to support that agenda. And with that, I hand back to Nadia, I think.
Thank you, Hall. So there's many other topics that you can also find in a full report, which you can download from our website at agcnsallianz.com. So there's also a standalone result appendix document that you can access, which details the most important business risk by industry. So you can see what's ranked for your sector as well by company size. On screen, you can also see some of our other recent thought leadership from AGCS that might be of interest to you. And you can also sign up for AGCS newsletter on the website so you don't miss any future reports we publish. So now it is the time to move over to the Q&A sessions. So you'll see the Q&A panel on the bottom of the right-hand side of your screen where you can submit your questions. Many thanks for those of you who have been sending in questions as we've gone through the presentation as well. And I can see we've got a lot of interesting ones. So I will start with the first one, which I think this one will be for you, Michaela. So what is the Allianz underwriting approach to cyber war and state-sponsored attacks?
Starting off with an easy one. No, thank you for the question, whoever submitted. This is, of course, a pretty big topic for the entire cyber insurance industry at the moment, as also proven by the length of time that all speakers on this panel have spent talking about the current geopolitical situation and the current level of threat that we're seeing. And I think that that conversation about war exclusion really started before the current Ukraine and Russia situation. I think it really started a few years back with WannaCry and NotPetya. Because coming out of those specific attacks, we've definitely seen litigation coming across, which wasn't necessarily targeted at cyber standalone policies, but other lines of business. But it still raised the question about the efficacy of war exclusions in the current environment. And what I mean by that is that war exclusions, particularly in the context of London Market and Lloyd's, have really been first drafted in 1938, so between the first two world wars, and they haven't really changed much since. And that was clearly before computers were even a thing. So I think that as a market, we definitely see the need to get up to speed with the changing times and the changing technology, and actually have a closer look together with industry experts such as technology analysts and lawyers as well, to make sure that those war exclusions are clarified and actually offer contract certainty to our clients in terms of scenarios that would be covered or excluded. In general, though, war risks, unless we're talking about a specific policy aimed at covering those, all other lines of businesses and products, including cyber policies, would definitely exclude those. But of course, given the complexities of the cyber landscapes, we definitely feel that there's need for additional clarity. And the AGCS position is that we're working very closely with the rest of the market and again, other experts to come up with solutions that are fair to clients and that offer additional clarity.
Thank you, Michaela. Another question, is Europe now sufficiently well prepared to manage without Russia gas? Anthony, I think this one will be for you.
Yeah, no, sure. Thanks, Nadia. So, great question. I think as a lot of us would have noticed, although perhaps not this week in the UK, we have had unseasonably warm weather throughout Europe in both autumn 22 and winter 22-23 so far. This delayed the heating season and allowed Europe's gas storage to be largely filled up to levels that we wouldn't have anticipated previously, and that really leaves us at the top end, the best case type scenario that the industry analysts would have been looking at in mid-22. When you add in the hugely impressive speed of the construction of the new LNG importing facilities, particularly in Germany, they've been busy offloading LNG cargoes from the Middle East and the US. We've had the right conditions for wind and hydropower. The French nuclear plants are coming back online. It's a much better situation than we would have or could have expected. And there was a very nice visual that someone posted on LinkedIn showing how the share of Russian gas in the German energy mix has evolved over the course of 22, and how they've managed to reduce that is quite frankly incredible. All things considered, power prices are returning to levels last seen before the summer of 22. However, they're still above long-term averages, and as hoped for growth, economic growth comes through, the industrial demand will rise. We've still got, looking further ahead, the winter of 23-24 to come, and despite having full storage now, if it were to be a bad winter, sort of a worse than average winter, then Europe would likely be short. Asian demand for gas, particularly LNG, could and probably will increase, but that is largely dependent on what happens in China. What I'd expect to see during 23 is a rethinking of the government policies that most European countries have put in place to support their citizens with their energy costs and the cost of living. I would expect those to become more targeted and ultimately at a lower overall cost to really focus on those who are vulnerable. The investments that are being made in low carbon sort of energy and power that I mentioned before will start coming online, but it will take longer to really deliver the full impact of those and to supplant the traditional sources of energy, at least on a consistent basis. So in short, I think Europe is much better prepared to manage without the Russian gas, but there is still a tricky 12 to 18 months ahead of us to navigate. Thank you,
Anthony. So I have another one very interesting. Serge, I'll ask your help on this one. It's a question that says, we've mentioned that there's an increased political volume. Is this increasing at a rate greater than proportional to population increase? Question mark. And there's a second part to the question as well, which is, will NGO, Greenpeace activity be something that will fall under political violence type of coverage? And if not, how the economic losses could be covered for interruptions, delays in project due to such activity?
Thanks, Nadia. Thank you. So the population question, so yes, I think there is a link to it. At the moment, it's probably slightly loose link, but naturally, I think it does kind of play in that space. So if you consider populations, increasing populations and demand for food, energy, fuel, etc., services by government, so there is a link to this, and I think that's why I mentioned that the states that prioritize these have dealt really well with the risk of SRCC. One thing that we are really watchful on is conflict around resources, and particularly, say, water. It's something that we're watchful on, for example, in North Africa and Central Africa, and other places. But for example, that one is something that we really can't do without. So it's something that's on our radar, and as populations increase and demand increases, combined it with some levels of let's say resource nationalism, you're going to have conflicts and you're going to have issues. And we're watchful, for example, on the Egypt-Ethiopia dynamic with regards to the Nile and other places and other similar resources. So we are conscious that this will be linked, and also relating it to natural disasters. I know that was slightly shifting the question, but there would be a link if there is an adequate governmental support for the changing climate for flooding, for earthquake support and various things. So there is a risk associated with natural perils leading to man-made perils in the political violence space. The other thing we talked about is a little bit about energy independence, and I think that will also increase as the populations increase, and that's a key topic. Therefore, the resource part is really, really important. You mentioned also a question on the NGOs. Would a Greenpeace intervention cause to a claim? Yes, that is something that's covered. We've seen a number of, not necessarily Greenpeace, but similar groups protesting, sabotaging, attacking pipelines or projects or protesting. Yes, that's exactly what the cover is for as well. And for that reason, it's a motivation that leads to a loss. Yes, these things would be covered, of course. With regards to business interruption, so I guess if it is a project and let's say Greenpeace attack it or somehow deny access to the sites, it would of course be covered under the policy if there is a physical damage trigger. So often we have a physical damage trigger as a requirement. The non-damage triggers are really, really rare, but they are sometimes given as a very, very small sublimit to PDBI policies. So I hope that answers your question, but do follow up if not.
Thank you, very good. Tim, question for you now. How is this interruption risk being impacted by inflation?
Thanks, Nadia. I think inflation is really, sorry, 1 second. Sorry, you're sharing room. So inflation is an outcome of supply and demand. Sorry, Tim, 1 second.
We have an echo.
Cool.
Are we good? Tim, you want to go ahead?
Right, so sorry about that. So yeah, I think really inflation at its basic level is just an outcome of supply and demand, as well as the broader macroeconomic factors, which are covered off in the barometer. But what we've seen, and I think partly through the COVID shutdowns over the last couple of years, the economic recovery coming out of that period of time, and latterly the energy crisis also impacting a lot of raw material costs, is just the availability and cost of raw materials, and also the labour costs as well, just driving how for property intensive businesses and business interruption that arises therefrom, how long it takes to reinstate a certain asset. So it's business interruption is a function of revenue over time. So if it takes longer, there's a higher business interruption chance and cost to that kind of event. So we've definitely seen that, and we monitor that kind of activity. We've seen it in our own claims stats. Maybe one other thing which is proving a challenge to a number of our clients is just the general economic output of different sectors and for businesses themselves. It's just proving hard to set a forecast on kind of what limits would be appropriate over time, and the sums insured around business interruption where it's insured. Because business interruption losses can take 2-3 years to settle. So if the loss happens in the last month of an annual insurance policy period, you're looking at events that are going to be affecting the trends affecting a business over a long period of time. So that's affecting both sums insured and then how we're looking at claims settlement using those trends as well. And maybe just the third part would be around actually the inflationary drivers driving other risks that I think we've already covered here. You know, the cost of living crisis and so on, driving strikes, which just a general disruption happening. Some of those potentially tipping over into the political violence that Serge was talking about. Other things, shortage of skilled labour force, potential recessionary factors, maybe driving supplier failure. So all of those things actually could be triggers of business interruption as well, coming out of a change in the inflationary environment, which we've seen in the last year or so.
Thank you, Tim. So I think we have a last one. Just a minute. So approximately what percentage of risk do the government take up in war political risk and SRCC risk? Approximately what percentage of funding do governments provide in claim settlements? Serge, I think it's for you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So now we've got, we've figured the technology out. So some governments offer pools around the terrorism space, and I think people are aware of that. Hence, this is a question about political violence and war. Relatively speaking, not to my knowledge, there is no government that provides a pool or a backstop to strikes, riots, civil commotion, and war perils. I do know, for example, in the UK, there is some old legislation that states that it's called the Riots Act. So if the police are responsible by moving people to a particular area and there is a riot, that they are then liable to pay some of the losses as a result of that. So it's an old act from 1800s, but it's still relevant today. Maybe there is legislation like that in countries, but as a well-known resource, there isn't anything. And the question, I guess, there is also: do governments buy political violence cover for their maybe assets? Yes, is the other question. They do come into the open market or us, and they do approach us about covering embassies, departments, ministries, and various other assets that they want. So yes, the answer is yes, but generally speaking, it tends to be the riskier part of the equation if you're talking about the central governments. More local governments and local assets like councils and municipalities, that's a better risk than central government. So the answer is yes.
Thank you. Well, thank you. So I think now it will be time to wrap up the call today as we're getting close to our time. So thank you everyone for joining us. And just a quick reminder, we have a very short pop-up survey that before you exit, and we would be very grateful if you can give us some feedback for your future events. And so as a reminder as well, the replay and slide will be available soon on our AGCS website. So thanks also for my fellow speaker, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.